January 17th, 1945. Luzon, Philippines. The transport trucks rumbled through the muddy roads carved into the Philippine jungle, their canvas canopies flapping in the humid wind. Inside, 23 women sat in silence, their bodies swaying with each violent lurch of the vehicle. They wore the tattered remnants of what had once been uniforms. Some Japanese Army Nurse Corps, others civilian volunteers who had followed the Imperial forces across the Pacific. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and something deeper. The knowledge that they had crossed into a realm they had been taught to fear more than death itself. They were prisoners of war. They were in American hands. The youngest among them, a nurse named Fumiko Hayashi, clutched a small bundle to her chest. A torn blanket containing the last of her possessions. A broken comb, a photograph of her family in Osaka, and a letter she would never send. She had been 22 when she volunteered for service in the Philippines, answering the call of the emperor with the fervor of youth and conviction. Now, at 24, she felt ancient. The war had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time. 3 years of service in field hospitals across the Pacific had shown her things she could never unsee. The wounded crying for their mothers, the dying asking for water she couldn't provide, the gradual collapse of the supply lines that had once made the Japanese military machine seem invincible. And now, this final humiliation, capture by the enemy she had been taught to see as demons incarnate. The trucks came to a halt outside a hastily erected compound near the town of San Fernando. The women were ordered out, and they descended slowly, their legs stiff from hours of confinement. American soldiers stood guard, their rifles at the ready, but their expressions not particularly hostile. Fumiko noticed this immediately. She had been told that American soldiers were barbaric, that they would violate prisoners, that capture meant unspeakable torture and certain death. Yet these men seemed almost indifferent. They gestured toward a series of tents and barked orders in English that none of the women fully understood. But the meaning was clear. Move forward. Enter the camp. Await further instruction. What happened next would shatter everything Fumiko Hayashi and her fellow prisoners believed about their enemy, about the war, and ultimately, about themselves. The Pacific War had reached its inevitable conclusion by early 1945, though the Japanese leadership refused to acknowledge the mathematics of defeat. American forces had island-hopped their way across thousands of miles of ocean, each battle bringing them closer to the Japanese home islands. The Philippines, once a jewel in Japan's Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, had become a desperate battleground where Japanese forces fought with the ferociousness of cornered animals. By January, General Douglas MacArthur had made good on his promise to return, and American forces were systematically dismantling Japanese defensive positions across Luzon. For the Japanese military personnel and civilian volunteers caught in this collapse, capture represented the ultimate failure. Imperial Japanese military doctrine explicitly discouraged surrender. The Senjin-kun military code, issued in 1941, stated clearly, "Never live to experience shame as a prisoner." Soldiers were expected to fight to the death, or, failing that, to take their own lives rather than submit to capture. This wasn't merely propaganda. It was deeply embedded in the cultural conception of honor, duty, and loyalty to the emperor. To be captured was to be erased, to become a non-person in the eyes of family and nation. For women serving with the imperial forces, the stigma carried an additional dimension of horror. Japanese propaganda had portrayed American soldiers as rapists and murderers who showed particular savagery toward female prisoners. Stories circulated through the ranks, some based on grain of truth, others pure fabrication. of women prisoners being subjected to systematic sexual violence. The message was unmistakable. Death was preferable to capture. Some women carried cyanide capsules or small blades, insurance against the fate they had been taught to expect. Yet, as Fumiko and her fellow prisoners entered the American POW compound that January afternoon, they encountered something that defied all their conditioning and expectations. They were directed toward a series of tents marked with red crosses. American nurses in clean-pressed uniforms emerged, accompanied by male soldiers who carried boxes and crates. The women prisoners clustered together, instinctively seeking protection in numbers, waiting for the violence they had been promised would come. Instead, one of the American nurses, a tall woman with kind eyes and graying hair at her temples, stepped forward and said something in English. A Japanese-American soldier, a Nisei interpreter, translated, "You will be processed and assigned quarters. First, you will have the opportunity to bathe and receive clean clothing." The words made no sense to Fumiko. She looked at the other women, seeing her own confusion reflected in their faces. Bathe? Clean clothing? This had to be some kind of cruel joke, a preliminary humiliation before the real punishment began. But the Americans seemed sincere. Two soldiers carried forward a large wooden crate and set it down, opening the top to reveal stacks of white towels, clean, thick, American towels that looked impossibly luxurious to women who hadn't seen such things in months. Another soldier brought forward bars of soap, individually wrapped, smelling of lavender, and something else Fumiko couldn't immediately identify. It was only later she would learn it was called ivory, a brand so common in America that it was considered unremarkable. Yet to her it seemed like an artifact from another world entirely. The American nurse gestured toward a tent that had been rigged with improvised showers, barrels of heated water connected to perforated pipes. Through the interpreter, she explained, "Each of you may bathe in privacy. Take as much time as you need. The water is clean and warm. Use the soap and towels freely. When you're finished, there will be clean clothes for you." Fumiko felt tears burning in her eyes, though she didn't understand why. She had prepared herself for brutality, for violation, for death. She had not prepared herself for kindness. She had not prepared herself for soap and towels offered without condition, without cruelty, without the sadistic pleasure she had been taught all enemies took in the suffering of prisoners. The historical record of this encounter, and thousands like it across the Pacific theater, reveals a consistent pattern that challenged every assumption Japanese prisoners held about American forces. Documents from the U.S. Army's Civil Affairs and Military Government sections detail the elaborate protocols established for prisoner processing. These weren't acts of exceptional humanity. They were standard procedure. American military doctrine, shaped by the Geneva Conventions and a fundamental belief in the dignity of prisoners, mandated specific standards of treatment. Prisoners were to be fed, housed, and given medical care. They were to be protected from violence and exploitation. And yes, they were to be given opportunities to maintain basic hygiene and human dignity. For Japanese prisoners, particularly women, this represented a cognitive dissonance so profound that many struggled to process it. Lieutenant Colonel Donald Nugent, who commanded POW operations in the Philippines during this period, noted in his after-action reports, "The Japanese prisoners, especially the women, initially refused to believe they would not be harmed. They cowered in corners, refused food, and some attempted self-harm rather than accept our assistance. It took days, sometimes weeks, for them to understand that our treatment of them was genuine and would continue." Fumiko was among the first to enter the bathing tent that afternoon, not out of courage, but because she was pushed forward by one of the older nurses who seemed to have accepted that resistance was futile. She stepped inside, expecting some kind of trap, but found only what had been promised: a simple shower arrangement, a bench for clothing, and, beside it, a white towel and a bar of soap. She undressed slowly, her hands shaking. The water, when she activated the simple valve mechanism, came out in a warm stream that felt like a miracle against her skin. She had not bathed properly in 6 weeks, since before the final American offensive that had overrun her field hospital. The soap lathered between her hands, and she began to wash, tentatively at first, then with increasing desperation, scrubbing away layers of dirt and sweat and the accumulated filth of collapse and retreat and capture. It was there, standing, under that improvised American shower with a bar of soap that cost perhaps 10 cents in any stateside drugstore, that Fumiko Hayashi began to understand that everything she had been told was a lie. Or if not a complete lie, then a truth so selective and distorted that it served the same function. The Americans were not demons. They were not monsters. They were simply people who had more supplies, more food, more of everything, and who had built their military doctrine around the radical notion that even enemies deserved a basic level of humane treatment. The soap became, in that moment, a symbol of something larger and more devastating than any bomb. It represented abundance, yes, but also a philosophical divide that Fumiko was only beginning to comprehend. In the Japanese military system, hardship was virtue. Soldiers were expected to endure with minimal resources, to demonstrate their spiritual superiority through material sacrifice. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to operate on the principle that adequate supplies and basic comfort made for more effective fighters. They didn't glorify suffering. They tried to minimize it, even for their enemies. Over the following days, this pattern repeated and deepened. The women prisoners were issued clean clothes, not Japanese uniforms, but simple cotton garments that were comfortable and modest. They were fed 3 meals a day from American military rations. The food was bland by Japanese standards, but there was enough of it. There was always enough. C rations and K rations, Spam and powdered eggs, white bread and canned vegetables. The industrial output of American agriculture processed and packaged for global war. After months of near starvation as Japanese supply lines collapsed, the sheer reliability of American food delivery represented a kind of miracle. Fumiko kept a diary during her captivity, which was later recovered and translated by occupation forces. Her entries from those first weeks reveal the psychological transformation that occurred. January 19th. We are fed again today, the same as yesterday, the same as the day before. They do not run out of food. How is this possible? January 23rd. The American nurse gave me medicine for my dysentery. She did not need to do this. I am the enemy. Why do they help us? January 28th. I have been here 12 days, and they have not hurt me. They have not hurt any of us. Everything we were told was wrong. How many other things were wrong? The medical care proved particularly revelatory. The American Medical Corps treated Japanese prisoners with the same protocols they applied to their own wounded. Fumiko, along with several other women suffering from tropical diseases, received treatments that had been unavailable in the collapsing Japanese medical system. Quinine for malaria, antibiotics for infections, IV fluids for severe dehydration. The American doctors and nurses worked with professional detachment, neither friendly nor hostile, simply doing their jobs according to standards that made no distinction between American, Filipino, or Japanese patients. This was documented extensively in the records of the U.S. Army Medical Department. Physician reports from POW camps consistently noted the poor health condition of Japanese prisoners upon capture, and the significant improvements after weeks of adequate food and medical care. A report from February 1945 stated, Japanese POWs typically present with severe malnutrition, untreated tropical diseases, and various injuries that have not received proper medical attention. Response to treatment is generally excellent once initial distrust is overcome. The greatest challenge is not medical, but psychological, convincing prisoners that the care offered is genuine and will continue. For Fumiko and her fellow prisoners, this consistency of care proved more persuasive than any propaganda could have been. The Americans weren't kind because they were trying to extract information or gain some temporary advantage. They were operating according to a system that demanded certain standards regardless of circumstances. The soap and towels weren't aberrations. They were emblematic of a military machine that had industrialized not just warfare, but also the logistics of humane treatment. This realization carried profound implications that extended beyond individual experiences. The Japanese military had built its ideology around notions of spiritual superiority, compensating for material disadvantage. Soldiers were taught that their dedication, their willingness to endure hardship, their samurai spirit would triumph over the materially superior but spiritually weak Americans. The propaganda emphasized American softness, their reliance on machines and supplies, their supposed inability to withstand true hardship. But in the POW camps, Japanese prisoners encountered the devastating counter-evidence to this narrative. The Americans weren't weak despite their abundance. They were strong because of it. They didn't need to glorify suffering because they had built systems to minimize it. Their willingness to extend basic humane treatment even to enemies wasn't weakness. It was a kind of strength that came from confidence in their own values and resources. Lieutenant Kenji Watanabe, a Japanese army officer captured in the same operation that took Fumiko and the other women, wrote in his post-war memoir about the psychological impact of American captivity. We had been taught that Americans were soft, that their love of comfort made them inferior warriors. But in the prison camp, I realized this was backwards. The Americans could afford to be humane to prisoners because they had no doubt about their own superiority. They had so much that they could give soap and towels to their enemies without diminishing themselves. We Japanese had so little that we could not even adequately supply our own troops, let alone care for prisoners. Which side, then, was truly strong? The symbolism of the soap, that simple, mass-produced American commodity, echoed through the prisoner experience as a representation of a deeper truth. It wasn't just soap. It was the visible manifestation of an industrial economy that could simultaneously wage global war on multiple fronts, while maintaining supply chains that delivered basic comfort items to remote jungle POW camps. It represented a society wealthy enough that even prisoners of war could be afforded dignity. It symbolized a value system that enshrined individual human worth, even in the brutal calculus of war. This wasn't propaganda. The Americans didn't stage these encounters for psychological operations purposes, though they certainly understood the value of humane treatment in encouraging further surrenders. The soap and towels were simply standard issue, part of the massive logistical apparatus that supplied American forces worldwide. But for Japanese prisoners confronting this abundance after experiencing the collapse of their own supply systems, these simple items became windows into a fundamental truth about the war they had been fighting. Records from the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, include numerous interrogation transcripts and prisoner statements that reveal this pattern of disillusionment. A common theme emerges. Japanese prisoners initially refused to believe American treatment was genuine, then gradually accepted it as reality, then finally began to question the foundational narratives that had shaped their understanding of the war. The psychological term for this process is cognitive dissonance, the painful mental conflict that occurs when new evidence contradicts deeply held beliefs. For Japanese POWs, the dissonance between what they had been taught about Americans and what they actually experienced proved transformative. Fumiko's diary entries track this transformation. February 3. The soap runs out and they give me more. This seems impossible, but it continues to happen. February 10th. I spoke today with one of the Nisei interpreters. He is Japanese by blood, but American by loyalty. He told me about life in America, about ordinary things, schools and shops, and freedom to choose one's own path. I don't know if I believe him, but I want to. February 18th. I have been a prisoner for 1 month. I am healthier now than I was when I was free. What does this mean about the war? What does this mean about everything I believed? The transformation wasn't instantaneous or universal. Some prisoners never reconciled themselves to their situation, maintaining their loyalty to the emperor and their belief in Japanese superiority despite all evidence to the contrary. But many underwent a fundamental shift in worldview, particularly as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, followed by the emperor's unprecedented radio address announcing surrender, completed the psychological revolution that had begun with bars of soap in a Philippine POW camp. The post-war occupation of Japan revealed the full extent of this transformation on a societal scale. Japanese civilians and former military personnel encountered the same pattern that POWs had experienced. Americans who had more, who could afford generosity, who operated according to values that prioritized individual dignity over collective sacrifice. The occupation authorities, under General MacArthur's direction, implemented policies designed to remake Japanese society along democratic lines. They weren't entirely successful, and the occupation carried its own forms of exploitation and injustice. But the fundamental gesture remained consistent with what Fumiko had experienced in that POW camp, an extension of basic respect and a commitment to establishing systems that protected individual rights. Fumiko Hayashi survived the war and returned to Japan during the occupation. Her diary was eventually published in Japanese in 1958, contributing to the growing literature of personal testimonies that helped Japanese society grapple with its wartime experiences. In an interview conducted in 1975, 30 years after her capture, she reflected on that first day in the American POW camp. When they handed me the soap and towel, I thought it was a trick. I thought they were mocking me before the real punishment would begin. It took me weeks to understand that there was no trick, that this was simply how they did things. And when I understood that, I had to question everything else I had believed. If they weren't demons, what were we? If their abundance made them strong rather than weak, what did our poverty mean? These were dangerous questions, but I couldn't stop asking them. The historical significance of these encounters extends beyond individual transformations. The treatment of Japanese POWs, particularly female prisoners, contributed to the post-war reconstruction of Japanese society in subtle but meaningful ways. Former prisoners returned home with stories that contradicted official propaganda. They spoke of American abundance, American fairness, American systems that seemed to work with mechanical efficiency. These testimonies, combined with the broader experience of occupation, helped undermine the militarist ideology that had dominated Japanese society for decades. Sociologist Emiko Onuki-Tierney, in her study of Japanese wartime experiences, noted, "The collapse of the militarist ideology was not sudden but gradual, built from thousands of individual revelations. For many Japanese, including former POWs, the turning point came not from grand ideological arguments, but from simple material encounters. Food that arrived on schedule, medical care provided without discrimination, soap and towels offered to enemies. These small gestures revealed a philosophical divide that no amount of propaganda could bridge. The soap, then, became more than soap. It became a synecdoche for the entire American war effort. The industrial might, the logistical sophistication, the ideological commitment to individual dignity that distinguished the American system from its adversaries. It represented what historian John Dower called the cultural gap between Japanese and American societies during the Pacific War. A gap measured not just in material terms but in fundamental assumptions about human value, about the relationship between individual and state, about what societies owed to their members and even to their enemies. For Fumiko and thousands of other Japanese POWs, this gap was first encountered not in abstract ideological terms but in the concrete reality of objects. Bars of soap, clean towels, adequate food, medical care. These things spoke louder than any propaganda because they were undeniable, physical facts that had to be reconciled with everything the prisoners had been taught. The reconciliation required nothing less than a complete revision of their understanding of the war, their enemy, and, ultimately, themselves. The epilogue to Fumiko's story reveals the long-term impact of that first encounter with American soap and towels. She trained as a nurse during the occupation and eventually became an advocate for peace education in Japanese schools. In her later years, she gave frequent lectures about her wartime experiences, always returning to that moment in the POW camp as the turning point in her understanding. "I learned more about democracy from a bar of soap than from any book or lecture," she told students. Because that soap represented a society that could afford to be generous even to its enemies. It represented values that didn't just exist in theory, but were built into the systems and habits of everyday life. That was what we had been fighting against, and that was what we could never defeat. Not because of their weapons, but because of what those weapons defended. The larger truth revealed in these encounters speaks to the nature of ideological conflict and the power of material reality to reshape belief. The Japanese militarist ideology had constructed an elaborate narrative of spiritual superiority, compensating for material disadvantage. It had taught soldiers and civilians alike that their sacrifices proved their worthiness, that their willingness to endure demonstrated their superiority over the materially comfortable but spiritually weak Americans. This narrative collapsed when confronted with the reality of American abundance directed toward humane purposes. The prisoners who received soap and towels from American soldiers in jungle POW camps were experiencing the confrontation between two complete systems of values. One system glorified sacrifice and viewed material comfort with suspicion. The other system assumed that abundance was good, that comfort enhanced rather than diminished human capability, and that even enemies deserved basic dignity. The war determined which system would prevail militarily, but the treatment of prisoners revealed which system could better satisfy fundamental human needs and aspirations. In the decades following the war, as Japan rebuilt itself into an economic powerhouse and democratic society, the lessons of that confrontation remained relevant. Former POWs like Fumiko became living bridges between the society that had sent them to war and the society that emerged from defeat. Their testimonies, grounded in the concrete reality of soap and towels, food and medical care, provided evidence that the democratic values the Americans espoused were not merely propaganda, but were embedded in practical systems that functioned even in the midst of war. The soap remained, in memory and in meaning, a symbol of that moment of recognition, the instant when ideology confronted reality and reality won. It was never just soap. It was the first small crack in a wall of lies that, once begun, could not be stopped from spreading until the entire edifice of militarist ideology came crashing down. It was the beginning of understanding that the war had been lost, not just militarily, but philosophically, that the enemy had proven superior not through cruelty, but through a systematic commitment to values that honored human dignity even when it would have been easier and cheaper to abandon such commitments. In the end, Fumiko Hayashi and thousands of other Japanese POWs learned what their military leadership had refused to acknowledge: that freedom and abundance were not opposing forces, but complementary ones; that societies built on respect for individual dignity could mobilize both greater material resources and deeper human commitment than societies built on enforced sacrifice and ideological rigidity. They learned this not from lectures or propaganda, but from the simple, undeniable reality of clean water, adequate food, and yes, soap and towels offered without condition or cruelty. These were the instruments of a quiet revolution, more powerful in their way than any weapon, because they revealed truths that, once seen, could never be unseen. The moment when an American soldier handed a bar of soap to a frightened Japanese prisoner was, in its small way, a moment when the future declared itself, a future where abundance and dignity would prove more powerful than deprivation and ideology, where the systems built on respect for individual human worth would ultimately prevail over those built on collective sacrifice and enforced conformity. It was a truth written not in grand declarations, but in the humble language of everyday objects that spoke volumes about the societies that produced them and the values they represented. And it was a truth that Fumiko Hayashi carried with her for the rest of her life. A truth that began with something as simple and as profound as soap and towels offered to an enemy who expected only death.